Now we begin the study of epistemology, or what I call the models of knowing. We'll have the definition of epistemology in the next slide, and then we will go through a number of the major epistemologies or models of knowing in philosophical history. We'll go back to Plato, and then we'll touch on Descartes briefly again, and then we'll go on and look at, in order, the epistemologies of Immanuel Kant, G.W.F. Hegel, Edmund Husserl, Jean-Paul Sartre, and Martin Heidegger. So that's the plan. The word epistemology comes from the two Greek words episteme, which means knowledge, and if you remember Plato's divided line, the highest division of that line was the level of episteme, or knowledge. And of course, logos, which in this case means the study of. So the study of knowledge, the study of how we know, theories of knowledge. And of course, there have been many epistemologies in history, and we won't have time to study them all, but we're going to touch on some of the major epistemologies, and we're going to try to visualize what these epistemologies are. Now, none of these models that I have presented here are adequate, but they're a good starting place for beginning the study of each of the epistemologies. So here's a reminder of Plato's cave, which is already in its own way a kind of model of knowledge, or an epistemological model, with the prisoners only seeing a mixture of illusion and truth, unable to discern the difference between illusion and truth, and therefore needing, in order to be able to tell the difference between illusion and truth, needing to get out of the cave to see the form of the good, which is independent of any sensory appearances, and is the truth itself. We have also discussed the divided line, which basically describes Plato's allegory of the cave in graphic form. There you see episteme on the far right, sorry, far left. This goes from right to left, um, and uh, you know, going from the images on the right uh, to the opinions formed on the base of the appearances, to a type of thinking, dianoia, a type of thinking that is independent of the senses, and finally to a knowledge which is not only independent of the senses, which is, in other words, thinking by itself or in itself, but also to a type of thinking that requires a type of purification or righteousness, a transformation of human nature. I will represent most of the epistemologies, not all of them, but most of them, in terms of a sort of subject object divide or starting place, where on the right you will have the world, which is the origin of sensory appearances and perceptions, and on the right you circle you will have the human self. And one of the things that we'll see throughout these epistemologies is the difference of opinions about the nature of the human self. And certainly we first see that with Plato's epistemology, which is based on the idea of the tripartite self that he inherited from Pythagoras, where the human self is comprised of body with its appetites and instincts, soul with the emotions, passions, and monkey mind, and the nous, the higher rational self, beginning with intellect and going all the way up to divine consciousness. And then, of course, the problem is how do these two relate? For Plato, because of the nature of the body, its reception of sensory appearances do not give us the full truth. And so, in order to know the truth, we have to raise our minds to the form of the good. And with that experience, then we can discern between the illusions and the truth that are embedded in all sensory appearances. Descartes agrees with Plato that sense appearances are challenging. They don't contain the complete truth. And for Descartes, they're not clear and distinct. And so he says he's going to destroy them, but as we saw in the last presentation, he doesn't so much destroy them as set them aside. So we can use the idea, Husserl's idea of bracketing, and just set the existence of the world aside, since we can't know whether or not it exists independently of our consciousness in the way that we perceive that it does. And we can then look at the cogito itself, which is absolutely self-affirming, because even if you doubt it, you thereby affirm it. So this results in, as you remember, Cartesian dualism, in which the problem is how does the self, which is absolutely secure, relate to the world, which is absolutely insecure? As you'll remember, Descartes overcomes this dualism by using some traditional proofs for the existence of God, the cosmological and ontological proofs for the existence of God. And given that God would that God gives us knowledge of God's self, God wouldn't fool us, and therefore we can trust what we perceive about the nature of the world. The philosophy of Immanuel Kant represents a development on Descartes' project. As I mentioned in the Descartes presentation, had Descartes followed up his insight into what he called innate knowledge, he might have short-circuited Kant. He might have come up with Kant's conclusions 150 years prior to Kant. Now, Kant is an interesting character. He was Mr. Milquetoast for the most part. Up into his maybe 30s or 40s, he had never written anything or done anything that anybody would remember him for. He lived in Königsberg in Prussia. Prussia at the time was one of the most repressive monarchies in the world, which made Kant's life interesting also, since he developed ideas about the relationship of independence and freedom and rationality that would get him in trouble a little bit, but that was later on. To begin with, he was a mild-mannered college professor. People in Königsberg said you could set your watch by the time of day he left the house. He never went further than 30 miles from his house in his entire life. He was Mr. Boring. But then he says he reread the works of David Hume, and in David Hume's works, David Hume was a Scottish philosopher of the generation earlier, and a very famous skeptic, one of the world's great skeptics. And Hume had pointed out that the causation, 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 the theory of cause and effect, or the existence of cause and effect, actually cannot be proven. In fact, all cause and effect is, Hume said, is an interpretation of regularities in nature. A regularity is something that happens over and over again. For example, if you drop something, it falls. If you do it in exactly the same way, all conditions being the same, it will always fall the same way, in the same place, at the same rate. We call this cause and effect, despite the fact that all it is an interpretation of the same thing happening over and over and over again, which Hume points out is also the definition of superstition. And the problem is, as Kant immediately saw, that if cause and effect, if causation is not knowledge, if it is in fact superstition, then science has no basis, because science is based on cause and effect, on the belief that cause and effect is meaningful. And this woke him up, he says, from his dogmatic slumber, and began what he would later call his Copernican revolution in philosophy, referring to the Polish astronomer Copernicus, who was one of the first to declare that the Earth was not at the center of the solar system, but the sun was at the center of the solar system, the heliocentric model of our solar system. So as earth-shattering as that was for astronomy and for our view of the universe, Kant knew that his defense of the idea of cause and effect would be equally important. The three major works in which he worked out his philosophy were the three critiques you see listed here. The Critique of Pure Reason, what he's trying to do is limit pure reason to eliminate metaphysics, which he views as abstract ideas built on other abstract ideas and not true knowledge. Now, of course, going back to at least Aristotle, and I'm sure Plato would agree, metaphysics was first philosophy. Metaphysics was the philosophy of philosophies. And Kant is saying, no, metaphysics is not knowledge, and we need to limit reason to what it can actually know. And that was the purpose of the first critique. The second critique, the critique of practical reason, deals with ethics. And as we'll see a little bit later on, those are related. The first and second critiques are related. Their projects are related. And the third critique has to do with aesthetics. And so it gets into areas that actually pushes Kant pretty close to what we might call German Romanticism. Here we see a model of Kant's epistemology. It again has the two circle structures. So on the right we have the world. You see some synonyms there. These are not terribly important and you won't be tested on them for the world, but it's called the in itself because, as Kant says, consciousness cannot reach it in itself. In other words, there is no way sort of for the conscious subject, the human subject, to leap out of our consciousness to verify that the world exists independently of our consciousness in the way that we think it does, and then to kind of confirm that. The world is in itself. It is sort of cut off. Or he also uses the word noumena, meaning dark. It is dark. In itself, it is what is. But until consciousness in some way lights it up, we don't know what it is. And so consciousness is the for itself. That is, that consciousness is aware of itself. And in that awareness of itself, it lights up the sense intuitions that come from the world. And that's what we call phenomena, based on the Greek word phenomenon, which means lit up. Kant is not going to bracket or doubt sense intuition, but he will say that if you take it by itself, so if you put your hand right now over the left part of the slide, the consciousness part of the slide, let's just look at sense intuition. Kant is going to say that our sense perceptions are not themselves knowledge, that in fact, if consciousness did not organize our sense intuitions at all we would have is a booming, buzzing confusion. So it wouldn't be knowledge. If you can kind of do a thought experiment, try to imagine what it would be like to get sensory input but have no way to organize it. It would just be a stream, a flood of meaningless sensory information. And so it would be crazy. A booming, buzzing confusion aptly describes it. All right, now take your hand off the left hand of the left part of the slide and put it over the right part of the slide where it says world. Now let's just look at consciousness itself. Kant says that consciousness is structured. It has certain structures that it gives to sense intuition. And these are called the a priori or innate structures of consciousness. And I've represented them by a square, a triangle, and a circle that don't mean anything. That's just a way of symbolizing that consciousness is structured. The major part of the a priori structures of consciousness is that it organizes our experience in space and time. Here again, you can try a thought experiment, which is really impossible to imagine what our experience would be like if it wasn't organized in space and time. Does that mean that everything would happen at one point of space and time, or stretched out over an infinity of? I mean, you can't even conceive of what that would be like. The categories, again, are a list of things that tell us what a thing is. And so Kant has his own list of categories. But those are innate structures that give meaning to the sensory intuitions that we have. However, keeping your hand over the right part of the slide again, however, these structures by themselves, with no sense intuition, would be empty. They would have nothing to fill them, and therefore they wouldn't be knowledge either. So, to get knowledge, you have to have both the a priori structures of consciousness and the sensory intuitions. That's knowledge. So that's what the lines at the bottom mean, where it says this plus this equals knowledge. You have to have both the a priori structures of consciousness and the sense intuitions coming from the world in order to have knowledge. Now, you want to know whether Kant was able to save science from Hume's skepticism, and the answer is yes, this would, because first we get a sensory intuition of regularities in nature, something happening over it. If you drop something, it drops the same way. So we have the sense intuition, and then we have the a priori structure of consciousness coming from the categories in which we interpret that regularity, that repeated falling of an object, for example, as causation being one of the categories. And so science is saved because it is based on knowledge. As I mentioned, for Kant, the a priori structures of consciousness are empty until they're filled with sensory intuitions. But Kant also thinks that we do have ideas or concepts that are based on the a priori structures of consciousness alone. Now, these are not knowledge, but we do have these ideas. And for Kant, these are metaphysical ideas. Ideas, in other words, that don't have any physical input from the senses and from the world. And therefore, their metaphysical ideas are not knowledge. And Kant is responsible for crippling, at the very least, the study of metaphysics for at least 100 years after him, or at least so modifying the field that it isn't what it used to be. This marks the end of a process in which metaphysical ideas gradually through the Middle Ages get divorced from the spiritual practices that gave them their meaning in the first place. And Kant is really the capstone of that project. Um, Nevertheless, I want to point out, and this is going into the second critique, the critique of practical reason. I want to point out, while we have Kant in our minds, that Kant thinks there are three metaphysical ideas that, even though they're not knowledge, we need to keep them in order to have a rational ethic. And as it says here, a rational ethic is one in which bad people would be consistently punished and good people would be consistently rewarded. And because we know that won't happen in this life, the only way we could have a rational ethic is if we assume an afterlife. Now, we can't assume any kind of an ethic without freedom, because if you're not free to choose, then you're not fully responsible for doing something good, or you can't fully be praised for doing something good or punished for doing something bad because you weren't free in the first place. And so freedom is necessary to any ethic, Kant thinks. The afterlife is necessary because in the afterlife, the good can be rewarded and the evil can be punished. And of course, God is necessary because God will do the rewarding and punishing. Notice that this means, because these are metaphysical ideas, this means that we have no sensory intuition of any of these three concepts. Obviously, we don't have a sensory intuition of freedom. I mean, that would be absurd, like saying, have you shaken hands with freedom lately, or could you hook freedom up to electrodes? No, we don't have any sensory experience of freedom. It's an idea. The afterlife, likewise, Kant thinks that we don't have any testimony to the afterlife, and well, that's a topic for another time, a very big topic. And he also claims that we don't have direct sensory experience of God. And that might be controversial depending on, for example, if you've read some of the mystics. Of course, they may be talking about a different set of senses, the spiritual senses, which allow them to experience God. But at any rate, it was commonly thought by educated Christians at the time of Kant that there was no such thing as a direct sensory experience of God. So Kant is not unusual in his own time in with Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, GWF Hegel, we take a real turn. In fact, the model of epistemology for Hegel is going to be utterly different from any of the others. And this is because he recognized a shortcoming in the previous epistemologies and worldviews, and that was that they didn't take time, they didn't take history, they didn't take relativism into account. The previous epistemologies, if you think about it, two circles pretty well describes it. They're static. They don't account for movement or change in ideas. Another thing that's not so obvious is that they are universalistic, meaning they assume that all consciousnesses have always been the same in all times and places. And therefore, when Hegel thinks about consciousness, he's going to try to see history, he's going to try to see consciousness as determined by history, which is called historicism. That is a kind of historical relativism that says that consciousness is not a given, but develops. Most of the material that I'm going to be giving you about Hegel comes from his great book, The Phenomenology of Spirit. This is a very difficult book to read, in particular because it begins with an introduction that Hegel wrote after he had written the rest of the work. So it is more dense and condensed than the rest of the book. So if you're going to try to read it, which I hope you will, start with the first chapters. Just skip the introduction until you're done. It should be said that the introduction to this book and this whole book have been a major influence in world history, really being responsible, fairly directly responsible for 3 or 4 of the most important revolutionary movements in modern times in the 19th and 20th centuries. Hegel is a direct influence on Karl Marx, though we don't have time to take a diversion into seeing the direct connection. Suffice it to say that Marx agreed that consciousness is historical, but disagreed about what made consciousness develop. And that's really going to be the departing point between Hegel and Marx. Kierkegaard, who we'll get to later in the semester, was also not a direct student, but at least a student of the followers of Hegel. And Kierkegaard had an unusual reaction. In fact, typical of Kierkegaard, his reaction to Hegel was his reaction and his alone. He wasn't part of a group of Hegel followers or of Hegel dissenters. Kierkegaard was always an individual. Now back to Hegel. So here we see that to depict Hegel's epistemology, we really have to make it a timeline. At the beginning of civilization, let's say, there is spirit. Spirit is not self-reflective human consciousness, but just awareness, like the awareness that is shared by all beings, all creatures, from a single-cell amoeba to the more complicated. History then develops, and we'll see how that happens. History is progressive. It progresses, and history is the development of human consciousness. So as history progresses, human consciousness develops. The final point being ultimately absolute spirit, in which all the forms of human consciousness have sort of been played out. Now, the forms of human consciousness occur in various stages of history. These stages are fixed. You can't skip one, you can't go back in time. Consciousness is always progressive, and the stages in which it progresses are fixed in history. It is also an objective process, meaning that your own personal spiritual development really is irrelevant to history. And it develops because what drives history forward, what drives the progress of history, is what Hegel called the dialectic. So next we'll look at Hegel's dialectic. Here we have a presentation of Hegel's dialectic, or Hegelian dialectic. We start at the bottom on the left with the thesis. First let's look at the arrow on the far left, and there you have an arrow pointing up, and it's labeled potentiation of consciousness. That means that as we go up in the rest of this model, as we go up, consciousness is getting more powerful. It's getting, we would say it's expanding, consciousness expansion. So, okay, back down to the bottom there. On the left, we have a thesis. What that means is really that could be any concept or idea or system of ideas that appears in history and has a major historical impact. So think of that as an idea being presented for the first time in history. Across from it, on the right, you see antithesis. The antithesis is uh, arises because the nature of human consciousness is that when any idea is presented to human consciousness, its opposite is also presented. Up doesn't come without down, good without bad. So we get an antithesis. Now, the thesis and the antithesis, of course, conflict with one another, but they can't completely cancel one another out because they need one another. The thesis can't exist without the antithesis. You can't have up without down, and therefore they have this relationship, kind of like uh, well they can never resolve this until they produce a higher idea that contains the essential elements of both, a kind of hybrid of thesis and antithesis, and that is the synthesis. But the synthesis is a new idea. And what happens when new ideas appear in history? Of course, its opposite also appears, and so we get a new antithesis. There is a struggle between the synthesis and the antithesis that produces a higher synthesis, and so forth and so on. So at each higher level of synthesis, the resolution between the conflict between ideas or the difference between ideas produces a new level of knowledge or a new level of consciousness for the human species as a whole. Edmund Husserl took a step backward in order to take a step forward. With Husserl, we are at the end of the 19th century, whereas with Hegel, we were at the beginning. And in that intervening period, a lot had changed. In Hegel's day, the accepted physical theory of the universe was that of Isaac Newton. His theories of motion, in fact, were so powerful and explained so much of reality that European scientists and philosophers tried to apply Newton's theories to absolutely everything, including things that weren't physical. So Newton's theories led to, of course, great developments in physics and astronomy and related sciences, but also the employment of Newton's theories also led to the rise of new sciences that studied humans, not just the physical nature of humans, but human society, anthropology and sociology, the human psyche, psychology, human relations, economics, human religions, the study of religions, and later the history of religions and comparative religions. So all of these sciences come out of the application of Newtonian theory. But during the 1800s, they tried every way possible to get Newton's theories to, as a method to develop the outcomes that they were that would make sense. And in the human sciences, it almost 100% failed. And so by Husserl's time, you had all of these new sciences in the universities. These were accepted bodies of knowledge or accepted disciplines, but each one of them had different outcomes and different methods and different expected outcomes. And Husserl saw this as suggesting that a crisis was right around the corner. Now, this was a time period at which many educated Europeans were very concerned that there was a crisis coming, and they differed about what would cause the crisis. But books like Oswald Spengler's *The Decline of the West*, were in the air at the time, and some people, at least, and I think Husserl in his own way, saw the coming tragedies of World War I and World War II. As well as the Russian Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, and other things that were right around the corner in the 20th century. In order to overcome this, disparity of methods and outcomes in the many sciences, Husserl invented phenomenology, which would provide, he hoped, would provide a single foundation for all the sciences. Now, why he thought this was important, why phenomenology would be able to provide something that none of the sciences themselves could, is twofold. First, the sciences are naively realistic. I think that is actually on the slide following the next slide. But at any rate, the sciences are naively realistic, meaning that, like most of us, the sciences assume that what they perceive using their senses or extensions of their senses like telescopes and microscopes is really there. When an astronomer looks through a telescope, he or she does not begin by saying to him or herself, how can I know that the things that I perceive through the telescope are there as my eye perceives them? If an astronomer were to begin with such questions, they might not get around to actually observing anything. So Husserl thought that philosophy could provide that foundation for all the sciences by exploring phenomena as they show up to consciousness, not according to any particular type of science, any particular method, not expecting any particular outcome, but just look at how consciousness itself gives phenomena to us. So Husserl takes a step back to Descartes. And he starts where Descartes does, assuming a cogito over against a world. And he as I mentioned in the Descartes material and earlier in this lecture when we talked about Descartes, the term Husserl is the person who came up with the idea of describing methodological doubt as bracketing. The technical term is phenomenological epoche. You don't need to know that. But essentially, what Husserl made very clear is that what Descartes does is not destroy his previous ideas, but sort of set them aside, not look at them. We're not assuming that they don't exist, but we're not assuming that they exist. But we're not assuming that they don't exist either. We're just setting them aside. We're not looking at what comes to us through our senses. We're only looking at the nature of the cogito itself, at the nature of the experience that consciousness provides us. That's all we're looking at in phenomena. This approach avoids the pitfalls of naive realism, among which is really the presumption of an epistemology. Most of the sciences assume their epistemology, they don't ever prove it. So if the sciences are supposed to be presuppositionless, they're in fact not, because they assume that what they perceive is really there as they perceive it. Phenomenology doesn't make that mistake. By the way, psychology also makes that mistake, which is why phenomenology is not just psychology. Phenomenology examines how the world appears to consciousness, and it doesn't matter whether or not the world exists externally to consciousness in the way that it appears that it does. We simply set that aside. Again, phenomenological bracketing or epoche. So, what do we find when we look at the way that consciousness gives us uh, reality, meaning, uh, when uh, when we look at how consciousness gives us our experience of phenomena? Well, the first thing we notice is that any conscious experience has an object. That is, that there is a subject object structure to all conscious experiences. It does not mean that we're always conscious, because obviously we're not. But what it means is that for any particular type of consciousness, there is a particular type of object. If you see, you're seeing something visible. If you know, you're knowing something knowable, etc. Now, this leads to the idea of phenomenological construction. Uh, Now, this does not mean that the mind or consciousness constructs reality. What it means is that in any conscious experience, we're never given a whole, WHOLE. We're given only parts. So, for example, as I look at this desk, I can see the top of the desk, I can see some of the front of the desk, but I can't see the back or sides of the desk. And yet, despite the fact that my senses don't give me that immediate experience, I know that the desk has a back and sides. How do I know that? Because my mind constructs that total experience from all these different perspectives. And this leads us to perspectivism and synthesis. Consciousness combines experiences in a variety of ways. I look at the desk, I don't assume that it's just a top and a front. I assume that it is a total desk, and that if I were to get up from my seat and to go over and look, I would see the side. But of course, when I'm looking at the side, I might no longer be able to see the whole front, in which case, maybe based on my senses, I might assume that it disappeared. Well, that is not how experience works, is it? We know the desk is a whole because even though we only ever see a specific perspective of it, through retention and protension, our mind constructs a whole. Retention means memory, essentially, that we remember different perspectives that we've had in the past of this desk and other desks, and we synthesize all of those experiences. Protension meaning that we project into the future, so that, I know that if I drop something over on the other side of the desk, that when I go to get it later, it will be there just where I dropped it. I'm projecting into the future in a way. That's protension. So that there is a kind of horizon, as Husserl will say, around experience that includes things that are directly in our focus, things that are less in our focus but are still giving, implied, like the sides and the back of the desk are implied in the surface and front of the desk. And then things that are more vague, like the office itself, like the pen on the floor on the over by the side of the desk that I can't see from where I'm sitting. All of these things, and including up into the entire universe, form the horizon of meaning of what is given to us in this particular experience. Jean-Paul Sartre is probably the most important French philosopher of the 20th century, um, although there were a significant number of others. But on the other hand, Jean-Paul Sartre, my feelings about him could be summed up in the title of an article I saw about him one time, and the title was, "Did Sartre Always Get It Wrong?" And there is a sense in which Sartre was able to take the influence of his predecessors and by sort of half understanding it, maybe more than half, but by half understanding it, he was able to sort of creatively mix and match different elements to create his own philosophy, and that is the philosophy of existentialism. Existentialism is an interesting non-movement. There were never too many people who were sort of card-carrying existentialists, if any, really, other than Sartre himself. Sartre tried to get other people interested in sort of committing to existentialism, including Heidegger, who expressed no interest, and his friend Albert Camus, who likewise was interested in other things. Also, existentialism includes, even though it doesn't include too many people in its own time, starting in the 1940s and 50s, existentialism today includes people that lived before existentialism was ever invented, including Søren Kierkegaard, who we'll talk about later in the class, who lived in Denmark in the early 1800s, Fyodor Dostoevsky, the Russian novelist who lived in the mostly in the latter half of the 19th century, Franz Kafka, who, though alive, I believe, during the time of existentialism, lived in Eastern Europe and may have known nothing about it and certainly was not part of that movement, but he is again included in it. And Friedrich Nietzsche, who died in 1900. So none of these folks was either around or aware of existentialism, but are included because in their writings or their philosophies, they have elements of existentialism. And probably the primary element that they all have in common is pretty nicely summed up in Sartre's motto, existence precedes essence. Now, existence here means being or reality, and for Kierkegaard, we can also say God. And we'll talk about this later. For Kierkegaard, God can really be translated pretty faithfully, existence being reality. But here, existence being reality, existence means being as a whole. And therefore, we're not talking about a specific being, but that which gives reality to all beings or makes all beings possible to show up, to be phenomena. And therefore, being is not an entity or an individual, and therefore has no concrete meaning. There's no specific meaning that we can put on the nature of existence itself. Put it another way, being or existence is not the kind of thing that has meaning. It doesn't lack meaning. It's just the kind of thing that meaning doesn't apply to. Where meaning comes from is human consciousness. And human consciousness opens up a hole or an opening in existence. It frees us from the determinism of existence. Existence without consciousness is determined. It's determined by natural law. There's no freedom. Animals are completely governed by instinct and appetite. But human consciousness opens up the possibility of resisting that determinism or adjudicating that determinism, deciding for ourselves, and that's freedom. Now, in one of his most famous statements, Sartre says, we're condemned to freedom because we didn't choose to have consciousness. If we lived in existence like, say, animals and organisms do, we wouldn't have the terrible questions that we have about the nature of our existence and the meaning. We wouldn't be tormented. So in a sense, we are condemned to freedom by the fact of consciousness itself. Here we see a model of the epistemology that I described on the previous slide, during the previous slide. First off, at the upper term there, existence, being reality, refers to the world as a whole, which has no meaning. And then we see an arrow that points to the center of the whole. So consciousness opens a kind of space or hole within existence. So while existence is deterministic, everything is governed by natural law, human consciousness is not. And it frees us from the determination of existence, the determinism of existence, and makes possible decision making in regard to existence. Now, this is both a blessing and a curse because while it does free us from the determinism of reality, it also means that every decision that we make determines who we are. And this is one of the hardest parts of existentialism. It is the sort of therapeutic, in a sense, part of existentialism. But whereas something like Freud's psychoanalytic theory would try to bring you to a cure and a closure of whatever your psychological ailment was, in the case of existentialism, one has to face the totality of one's being. That is, the totality of the decisions one has made for oneself. And one has to determine whether uh, he or she can own the totality of the decisions that we've made. And the decisions that we made include even things that we didn't actively decide, because when you don't decide, you're also making a decision. So basically, every event of our life determines who we are, whether we like it or not. And that's what we have to deal with in terms of remaining free and making decisions. So the more meanings we create, the less free we are, because condemned to be free, we can't not create meanings. So the result of this is that there are authentic and inauthentic ways to live. Authentic ways of living are ways in which we own the totality of our experience. Inauthentic ways, we don't. And the primary inauthentic way that Sartre deals with is what he calls bad faith. Bad faith is where we try to disown aspects, experiences that we've had, events in our lives that are too traumatic or too tragic to deal with. And if we try to justify those, if we try to escape those, then we're in bad faith. The prime example of bad faith is certainly Sartre's play No Exit, in which two men and two women are ushered into a small drawing room with kind of an overstuffed couch with faded upholstery and a mantelpiece that hasn't been dusted in years and a cold fire grate and faded wallpaper. Just not a very pleasant place. Two men and two women are ushered into this room by a butler who then leaves. And when they're all assembled, they start to talk to one another, and they figure out pretty quickly that in fact they are all dead, and this is some form of the afterlife. They also quickly assume that the butler will be back to take them on to wherever it is that they're going in the afterlife, that this is only a waiting room. And so they think, while we're waiting, why don't we, find out each other's stories? And so they each tell their story in turn, and is finally revealed that each one of the people in the room is in bad faith in exactly the way that will upset the other three people in the room the most. So, for example, one woman, and I don't remember the exact details, but it was something like she left her husband for another man. This other man abused her and her son and ultimately killed them, something like that. Anyway, and of course, this upsets the morality of one of the other people in the room, who is in bad faith in a different way for different reasons, which upset another person. So they're all in bad faith toward one another. And Sartre's famous line in this play is, "Hell is other people." And of course, you can reflect on that all day, of how that applies to society and how we all determine each other through our own repression of our own worst aspects, at any rate. The gaze is another concept based in the same basic philosophy that Sartre gives us, and has been very influential, in particular in women's studies and feminist thought and ethnic studies and areas like that, where you have a minority group who is in some sense determined by quote unquote the gaze of the dominant group. And that might apply to women as they are dominated by the male gaze. In other words, the way in which men objectify the female body, and that when women internalize that viewpoint, then it creates problems. This concept has been applied in many areas, as I said, has been a very powerful concept uh, in social We might say that Martin Heidegger is an enigma mixed up in a conundrum. On the one hand, he is probably the most influential of the philosophers of the 20th century. On the other hand, he was a Nazi, and not only just a Nazi, but a really pretty nasty Nazi. Um, Certainly not one of the Nazis were, who were perhaps deserving of punishment at the end of the war, but certainly someone who never apologized for his role in the activities of the Nazi Party in Germany in the 1930s. Um, in addition to that, he personally was not a particularly nice guy in his moral life, at least. He was a married man who had an affair with at least one of his students. And oddly, for a Nazi, one of those students happened to be a Jewish student. She also later on happened to become one of the great philosophers of the 20th century named Hannah Arendt. But they had a quite intense affair for a period and then maintained a correspondence for many years afterward. So we're dealing here with not a nice guy who produces a philosophy that is difficult, complex, and very difficult to deal with. That said, Being in Time is an extension, really, more I think more than a break with Heidegger's mentor Husserl. And I say here that Heidegger stabbed Husserl in the back. Husserl was an emeritus professor, meaning that he wasn't teaching anymore, but that he still had campus privileges. And because Heidegger was a member of the Nazi Party and Husserl was Jewish, Heidegger cut him off. So Husserl shortly after left and went to Switzerland for the remainder of the war period. So Heidegger even stabbed his own mentor in the back. Nevertheless, it has to be said that Heidegger built on what Husserl had produced. I think the major insight of Heidegger's early philosophy is that Husserl's concept of intentionality implies that we don't need to assume a distinction between the self and the world. We don't need to start from the point of any kind of dualism between inside and outside, but that if consciousness is intentional, that consciousness, as Heidegger would say, always already comes with a world. The world is sort of built in to the way that we experience our own consciousness. And therefore, it's unnecessary to assume a self-world distinction. For this reason, he also rejects all of the traditional terminology for the self, whether it's spirit or soul or nous or consciousness or subject. He instead uses a word that's based on two common German words, which are da, which means there, and sein, which means being. So you could translate this there being or being there. Heidegger also explains this term in a couple of other ways. First, this is the being of the being that knows its own being. Notice the capital B in the first and the third cases of that sentence, or it's not even a sentence, but anyway, and that the second being is not capitalized. So he's talking about the nature of the entity, the species, if you will, human, that knows its own being. In other words, it knows its own nature. What is the nature, in other words, of human being such that it knows its own being? It knows its own nature. No other creature that we know of, with possible exceptions, but for the most part, no other creature that we know has the ability to know its own nature as human beings do. For a related reason, Heidegger also defines Dasein as being in the world. That is, that we are always already within a context of meaning. We are never a meaningless consciousness over against a world of meanings, nor are we a consciousness full of meanings over against a meaningless world. Rather, we are always already within the context of meaning. So we might depict Heidegger's ontology this way. We have the horizon of being, against which beings show up. Being, Heidegger says, lights up being, which is, again, the meaning of the word phenomenon. It means to be lit up. Dasein knows entities because being lights them up. There is a light to consciousness, which you can see for yourself if you just look at your ideas and you ask yourself, where did these ideas come from? How did they show up to me? if they showed up, if ideas show up to our mind, then somehow they must be lit up. What is it that lights them up? Well, that would be being, according to Heidegger. Entities show up against this horizon of being. Now, that said, there is a limitation to this relationship, which is that though Dasein relates to individual entities or individual beings with a small b, Dasein never perceives being with a capital B directly. And as a result, we see beings as discrete individual beings, not in the context of their universal being. And this, for Heidegger, is what is inauthenticity. So the question is how we would have an authentic relationship to beings or entities. We would see them in their being. We would not take them for granted, but we would see them in their being, in their ultimate being. Heidegger says that Dasein is thrown into being, which means two things. First off, we don't choose to be here. We're here, not of our own choosing. Nobody says, but prior to birth, I want to be born now. It's not a choice. That's one thing it means. But thrownness also means that we are immersed in a world of meanings that pre-exists us, that exists before we do, and that gives us a horizon of meaning from which we draw. And that we tend to take that for granted. And when we take it for granted, we live in an inauthentic relationship to being. Now, he also points out that part of the reason for living in inauthenticity is that that directly relating to being causes ontological anxiety. That is, that we fear being in itself because it is not an individual, it is not an object, it can't be made an object. It is that which makes objects show up, but it is itself not an object. And so, therefore, the idea of relating to it scares us, and therefore, we tend to resort to what Heidegger refers to as talk, everyday talk. In other words, we just chatter insanely about anything rather than face the ultimate emptiness of existence itself. That is, that being is not an object, it's not a thing. It is only that which gives context and meaning to things. Now Sartre, actually, Kierkegaard, Heidegger gets his ideas about anxiety from Kierkegaard. And in Kierkegaard's book, The Concept of Anxiety, which was the first philosophical thematization of the concept of anxiety. In other words, the concept of anxiety already existed, but Kierkegaard made it into a philosophical theme by writing this book. In that book, he gives us an image of ontological anxiety that I'll finish with. And that is, he takes the Adam and Eve story and he says, and now I'm paraphrasing, you see, in the first books of Genesis, or first chapters of the first verses of Genesis, there you see Adam and Eve walking with God in the garden, and God is showing them around, and God is saying, here's the lion lying down with the lamb. And Adam and Eve say, well, what's that tree over there? And God says very sternly, that's the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. Don't eat the fruit of that tree, because on that day you shall surely die. And looking at them, with a hairy eyeball, looking at them through his eyebrows, he gives them a stern look, and he says, all right, Adam and Eve, great to see you, great to talk to you, gotta go, real busy, see you later. And after God leaves, Adam and Eve turn to one another and say, what? We'll do what? If we eat the fruit, we'll do what? We'll die? What die? What's die? What's death? Because, Kierkegaard points out, death, nobody had died yet. So Adam and Eve could not possibly have understood what the threat was. But they knew it as a threat. And that describes the structure of anxiety. Anxiety is a fear response in the absence of an object of fear. So a fear response is a fight or flight response, such as if you're going to be eaten by a lion, your heart rate increases, your blood flow increases, etc. You get ready to run or to fight. That's a fear response. But ontological anxiety is the fear response in the absence of the lion. Because, in the case of Adam and Eve, they feared death. They were anxious about death, we should say. But death is not an object. Death is not a thing that can be feared because it's not an object. It's not a thing going to, that you can objectify. And the same is true of being, Heidegger points out. We cannot objectify being, and therefore it scares us. And as we see with Sartre's picture, if you back up to the slide on Sartre, we see that meaning, in a sense, is a small hole. Essence, in a sense, is a small hole within the vastness of being. What would happen if that small hole of meaning collapsed? That's what we see in Sartre's great novel, Nausea, which is in the form of a diary written by a middle-aged historian, Roquentin, who has found his research has led him. He's researching some historical general or something. His research has led him to Podunksville in the middle of France, where he has no contacts, no family relations, no nothing. So the meanings of his life, his family, his occupation, all of these things, he's sort of left behind. And when he gets there, he also realizes that he doesn't care about what he's researching, and he doesn't care about research, and he really just has no connections and no meanings. And in a sense, if you look back at that picture on the Sartre slide, being starts to fill in that little circle of meaning and to close in and close in and close in until Roquentin doesn't have any meanings left to live by and is faced with being or reality itself, which creates the nausea or the anxiety that Sartre refers to.